What if I told you that everything you believed when looking at the formal portraits of the Gilded Age was a lie? Behind the glossy facades of Fifth Avenue mansions lay a world where walls had ears, and silence was bought at the price of human destinies. We are used to seeing balls, diamonds, and exquisite dinners, but real life at home took place in cramped corridors, hidden from the eyes of guests. It was there, on the narrow service staircases, that the reputations of great dynasties were decided, and hopes for happiness were destroyed. The luxury of the living rooms was just a facade, behind which hid a cold and calculating system of social control. Women, bound by corsets and conventions, were not masters of their own destiny, but merely expensive ornaments in golden cages. Their lives were subject to the strictest schedule, where every sigh and glance could cause a catastrophe. The servants, gliding like shadows through the house, knew more about their masters than they could ever imagine. They saw the tears that the mistress hid from her husband and heard whispers that were not meant for strangers' ears. Watch the video to the end to find out how an invisible network of service staircases became the main artery through which the poison of gossip rose from the kitchens straight to the master's bedrooms. I discovered this by accident while studying old drawings of late 19th century New York mansions. Houses of that era were designed not simply as dwellings, but as complex mechanisms of segregation, where the flow of people was never supposed to intersect. Architects created a dual reality: spacious, light-filled halls for the owners and narrow, dark labyrinths for the servants. These two worlds were separated only by a thin door covered with green cloth to muffle sounds and smells. This door was a boundary that the lady of the house rarely crossed, preferring not to know what was happening on the other side. For the servants, however, this passage was a daily ritual that required an instant transformation. Beyond the threshold of the living room, they lost their names and became faceless functions, serving tea or adjusting trains. The service staircases were narrow, steep, and devoid of any decoration, unlike the marble front steps. Here it smelled of wax, starch, and the hard work that kept the upper floors shining. It was here, in the dim light of the stairwells, that maids and footmen exchanged snippets of overheard conversations. Any information that fell from the master's table was instantly picked up and passed on through this invisible network. A secret told in the boudoir was discussed an hour later in the laundry room and kitchen. A system of bells and speaking tubes permeated the house like a nervous system, connecting the basement to the upper floors. The mistress could summon a maid at the touch of a button without even raising her voice. But this same system worked in reverse, allowing the servants to hear what was happening in the most intimate corners of the house. There were often hidden niches and passageways in the walls that guests were unaware of. This allowed the staff to appear out of nowhere to change candles or pick up a dropped handkerchief. Such omnipresence made them ideal spies by necessity, from whom it was impossible to hide. The very architecture of the house dictated the rules of the game, where privacy simply did not exist. A wealthy woman was never alone, always surrounded by silent witnesses to her life. Even in her own bedroom, she felt attentive eyes on her, evaluating her every move. The servants' quarters were often located at the very top, under the roof, or in damp semi-basements. This contrast between the living conditions of the servants and their masters created hidden tension. Envy and resentment often fueled gossip that could destroy the mistress's reputation. Every mansion was a theater where the stage was brightly lit and the backstage was perpetually dim. It was in this dimness that stories were born, which were then whispered in high society salons. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about a life where even the walls have eyes and ears? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what happened behind the closed doors of women's bedrooms every morning? A socialite's morning did not begin with coffee, but with the arrival of her personal maid, who drew back the heavy velvet curtains. In those early hours, when the mask of a socialite had not yet been put on, a woman was at her most vulnerable. She appeared before her maid without embellishment, tired, perhaps tearful after the night. The process of getting dressed in those days was a long and physically demanding ritual that could not be performed alone. The maid knew every flaw in her mistress's body, every wrinkle and every bruise. This forced physical intimacy erased social boundaries, creating an illusion of trust. Tightening the corset was not just a tribute to fashion, but a symbol of the daily confinement of women within the rigid framework of expectations. While the maid laced up the corset, the mistress often shared her experiences, forgetting who was standing behind her. These morning conversations were a kind of psychotherapy for lonely women in huge empty houses. The maid, combing her mistress's long hair, listened to complaints about her husband's coldness or the boredom of social gatherings. She nodded and agreed, but every word was stored in her memory. It was in the boudoir, among the perfume bottles and powder compacts, that the most dangerous secrets were born. Here, letters that needed to be burned were read, and notes that no one was supposed to see were hidden. The maid often became an accomplice to little secrets, which gave her a certain power over her mistress. Sometimes a strange, almost friendly bond developed between a woman and her maid, based on the isolation of both. The mistress was locked in a golden cage of convention, and the maid in a cage of poverty and dependence. But this friendship was always fragile and could be broken at any moment at the whim of the mistress. Nevertheless, the maid was the first filter through which information from the outside world passed. She brought news, gossip about other families, rumors of upcoming engagements or scandals. The morning toilet could last for hours, turning into an endless exchange of information. It was a time when social armor was removed and true human nature was revealed. But as soon as the last hook on the dress was fastened, the magic disappeared. The mistress became an unapproachable lady again, and the maid a silent shadow. I wonder if you think that such forced intimacy was a salvation from loneliness or a dangerous trap. It exceeded all my expectations when I immersed myself in the diaries of the so-called poor relatives. The homes of wealthy ladies often housed a special category of women whose role was even more ambiguous than that of servants. These were companions, impoverished noblewomen or distant relatives who received no salary but lived on the family's allowance. They did not wear uniforms and sat at the same table with their hosts, but their position was precarious and humiliating. A companion was obliged to entertain the hostess, read to her aloud, accompany her on walks, and put up with all her whims. She was even more invisible than a maid, because she was not even expected to do physical labor. Her task was simply to be present, creating a backdrop for the mistress's glamorous life. It was these women, sitting with their embroidery in the corner of the living room, who saw and heard absolutely everything. They were often ignored by guests who considered them to be part of the furniture, and the most candid conversations were held in their presence. The companion knew about the family's financial problems, the daughter's secret love affairs, and the son's debts. Her silence was the price she paid for a roof over her head and food, but inside she often felt bitter. She saw the luxurious life that was so close, but which she could never have. This envy, mixed with gratitude, created a complex emotional cocktail. Companions often became the main keepers of family chronicles and secrets. Their letters to their relatives contained the most detailed descriptions of the everyday life and customs of that time. They described not only dresses and balls, but also hidden tears and cold alienation between spouses. Their status as almost family members allowed them to go where servants were not allowed. They could be present during family quarrels, trying to smooth things over and calm the angry head of the family. For the lady of the house, the companion was the only person in her circle with whom she could talk as an equal. But this equality was illusory, for one owned everything, while the other had nothing but a trunk of old dresses. The companion's loneliness was perhaps the deepest in this house full of people. She belonged neither to the world of servants nor to the world of masters, stuck in an eternal limbo. Don't forget to like if you were touched by the fate of these invisible women who lived in the shadow of someone else's wealth. What if I showed you a time machine that would transport us straight to the dining room of the Vanderbilt mansion? A formal dinner was the culmination of social life, a performance where every movement was rehearsed. The table, covered with a snow-white tablecloth, sparkled with silver and crystal, reflecting the light of hundreds of candles. At the head of the table sat the hostess, whose smile had to remain flawless despite her tight corset and inner tension. Around the table, like guards, stood footmen in livery, ready to fulfill any wish of the guests. They moved silently, filling glasses and changing plates, trying to be completely invisible, but their ears caught every word spoken at the table, every ambiguous joke, and every hint. Small talk was the art of talking about nothing, hiding true thoughts and feelings. The guests discussed opera, the weather, and mutual acquaintances, carefully avoiding sensitive topics. But the servant's eyes noticed what was hidden: a trembling hand holding a glass, furtive glances, and the tense silence between spouses. Behind the wall in the kitchen, the atmosphere was completely different: hot, noisy, and chaotic. Trays of untouched food and the latest news from the dining room converged here. The footman, returning to the kitchen, immediately recounted to the cooks and dishwashers who had been flirting with whom and how much everyone had drunk. Food was not just sustenance, but a status symbol, a way to demonstrate wealth and taste. The numerous changes in dishes required complex logistics and the coordinated work of dozens of people. A mistake by a footman could be disastrous for the hostess's reputation, so tension hung in the air. The hostess watched every move of her servants, directing this ballet with barely noticeable gestures. Her calmness was a mask hiding her fear that something would go wrong. The servants saw how, under the influence of wine, the guests' tongues loosened and the mask of propriety began to slip. They witnessed marriages being made and business partnerships collapsing. After dinner, when the guests dispersed to the drawing rooms, the dining room was instantly transformed by the hands of the servants. The silver was counted and locked away in safes, and the tablecloths were sent to be washed. This contrast between the glittering facade of dinner and the hard work that made it possible was the essence of that era. But what happened when the candles were extinguished and the doors of the ballrooms were closed? We will discuss this in the next chapter. The ballroom was the heart of social life, a place where the main commodity of the era, young girls of marriageable age, was put on display. To the sounds of the orchestra and the rustle of silk, destinies were decided and deals were made, disguised as romance. Mothers seated along the walls on velvet sofas watched their daughters' every dance closely. Their fans moved to the beat of the music, but their eyes were cold and calculating, assessing potential suitors. For a young debutante, the first ball was a test comparable to going into battle. She had to look fresh, cheerful, and carefree, while her corset prevented her from breathing deeply. Any mistake in etiquette, any wrong glance or word could ruin her reputation forever. The richness of the dress served as a signal to society about the financial status of the bride's father. Diamonds in her hair and meters of expensive lace spoke louder than any words about her dowry. The girl was a living showcase of her family's success, and this burden of responsibility weighed heavily on her fragile shoulders. Men in black tailcoats circled around the girls, choosing the future mistress of their home. They were looking not only for beauty, but also for obedience, a noble name, and of course, money. Love in this equation was often an unnecessary variable that was not customary to talk about aloud. The servants, watching the ball from the galleries or through half-open doors, saw this Vanity Fair without embellishment. They knew how many hours had been spent on hairstyles and how many tears had been shed in front of the mirror because of a pimple or an unfortunate dress. They saw mothers scolding their daughters in the dressing rooms for not being charming enough to a rich old man. The music drowned out the whispers, but it couldn't hide the tension in the air, saturated with the smell of expensive perfume. The fear of remaining an old maid, an unwanted commodity, haunted every girl in the hall. The glitter of the chandeliers reflected off the parquet floor, creating the illusion of a fairy tale. But for many, this fairy tale was the beginning of the end of their freedom. Marriage was the only goal, the only career available to women of that circle. After the ball, when the last carriages had left, the house fell silent and a time of fatigue and disappointment set in. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of that time. Paper was more dangerous than dynamite. In an era when there were no telephones or the internet, letters were the only way to communicate over long distances. Women spent hours at their writing desks, penning lines full of hope or despair in calligraphic handwriting. But every word written was evidence that could be used against the author. Letters were delivered by servants, and this was the weakest link in the confidentiality system. A footman or maid could intercept a note, read it, or even sell it to an interested party. Blackmail based on stolen letters was a thriving shadow business. Women lived in constant fear that their intimate thoughts would become public knowledge. One careless word, one hint of feelings for a man who was not her husband could destroy her reputation. Therefore, many letters were burned immediately after reading, turning to ashes in the fireplace. But sometimes passion or foolishness compelled them to keep the cherished envelopes tied with ribbon in a secret compartment of a box. The discovery of such a bundle of letters by a husband or jealous rival led to tragedy. Servants knew the handwriting of all their master's friends and acquaintances perfectly well. From the envelope alone, they could guess who the letter was from and what news it contained. Handing the letter to his mistress on a silver tray, the butler watched her reaction closely. Trembling hands, sudden paleness, or a blush spoke more eloquently than any text. These observations were then discussed in the servants' quarters, adding new details to the picture of their masters' lives. The art of reading between the lines using the language of flowers and hints was a vital skill. Women learned to encrypt their feelings, hiding them behind a veil of social politeness. Letters were the only outlet, an opportunity to speak their minds, albeit on paper. But this freedom was illusory and constantly threatened with exposure. History knows many examples when a found letter led to duels, divorces, and suicides. Paper, which can endure anything, sometimes could not bear the weight of human secrets. Do you think it was easier to keep secrets back then? Or is it easier to do so in our digital age? When illness came to a wealthy home, it tore off all the masks and exposed the true position of women. The luxurious bedroom, which had previously served as a boudoir, was transformed into a hospital ward and sometimes even a prison. The mistress, deprived of her strength and ability to go out in public, found herself completely dependent on those around her. At such times, power in the house often passed into the hands of nurses and senior maids. They controlled access to the sick woman, decided when she should sleep and what she should eat. The husband, busy with business or social life, might not enter his wife's room for days, limiting himself to formal questions about her health. Illness often became the only legal way for a woman to get a break from her exhausting duties. Nervous fever, or migraine, allowed her to shut herself in her room, draw the curtains, and simply lie in silence. It was a kind of rebellion of the body against the rigid corset of social norms. But prolonged illness carried with it the threat of oblivion and loss of status as the mistress of the house. A woman confined to bed lost control of the household, and her place was quickly taken by others. Servants saw the suffering and physical weakness that were hidden from the eyes of guests. They carried out bedpans, changed linens, and heard delirious ramblings during feverish hours. This unsightly side of life was carefully hidden behind closed bedroom doors. Doctors of that era often attributed any female ailments to hysteria and weakness of character. The treatment could be no less painful than the disease itself: bloodletting, opium tinctures, isolation. The silence in the house during the mistress's illness was oppressive and disturbing. The servants tiptoed around, whispering, as if afraid of disturbing not only the sick woman, but death itself. For a woman, illness was a time to rethink her life, often leading to bitter conclusions. She understood that her value to society and her family was measured solely by her ability to be beautiful and healthy. Recovery meant a return to duties, to endless visits and receptions, to wearing a mask of well-being. But the memory of helplessness and loneliness remained forever. Illness showed how fragile the world of luxury was and how little it meant in the face of physical pain. A scandal in high society was like a forest fire. It flared up from a single spark and destroyed everything in its path. For a woman, the loss of reputation was tantamount to social death, after which there was no resurrection. The cause could be anything: a dress that was too revealing, dancing with the wrong man, or simply the malicious gossip of an envious woman. The mechanism for spreading rumors was perfected and worked faster than the telegraph. A maid would tell the news to a footman, the footman to the coachman, and the coachman to his colleagues from other houses, while they waited for their masters. By evening, the whole city knew about the lady's misdemeanor, from the back alleys to the aristocratic clubs. The woman who became the subject of scandal instantly found herself in a vacuum. Yesterday's friends stopped recognizing her on the street, invitations to balls ceased, and doors closed. It was a cold, cruel boycott that could drive a person mad. The servants in the disgraced house were the first to feel the change in atmosphere. Visitors stopped coming, the phone was silent, and the mistress did not leave her room for days. The staff often began to look for new jobs, unwilling to serve in a house with a tarnished reputation. Husbands in such situations often acted as judges and executioners. Divorce was a disgrace, so an unfaithful or simply compromised wife could be sent into exile, to a distant estate or abroad. The woman became a ghost in her own lifetime, someone who was not to be talked about. Her name was crossed off guest lists, her portraits were taken down from the walls or hidden away in distant rooms. The worst thing was that the scandal was often based not on facts, but on speculation. But in a society where appearances were more important than substance, no one was interested in the truth. Gossip was a weapon of social control, a way to keep women in fear and submission. Everyone knew, one step to the right, one step to the left, and you would be destroyed. The victims of scandals were often the most vibrant, independent, and lively women who refused to conform to narrow norms. Their downfall served as a lesson to others, forcing them to be even more cautious and quiet. History remembers the names of those who could not survive the shame and chose poison or the noose as their only way out. The summer move to country residences such as Newport seemed like an escape to freedom and nature. Huge mansions on the ocean shore, sea breezes, yacht trips. Everything promised a respite from the stifling city. But in reality, the social constraints were even tighter here. Only the scenery had changed. Life in a country house was even more open and public than in the city. Guests came for several weeks, living under the same roof as their hosts, which created an incredible intimacy. The walls here were often thinner, and the sound insulation worse than in city-stone mansions. Servants in country houses worked in even more difficult conditions. They had to serve not only their masters, but also their numerous guests with their own servants. Kitchens and corridors turned into anthills, where someone was constantly running around, carrying water, cleaning shoes. It was here, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, that resort romances, doomed to failure, often began. The relaxed atmosphere of picnics and tennis created an illusion of freedom that was deceptive. At night, when the house fell silent, the creaking floorboards betrayed those who crept through the corridors to bedrooms that were not their own. Servants, who often slept in neighboring rooms or in the attic, heard every rustle. The country season was an endless marathon of changing clothes, a dress for breakfast, for tennis, for a walk, for tea, for dinner. A woman was a mannequin who had to match every hour of the day. The surrounding nature was beautiful, but women rarely had the opportunity to enjoy it alone. Even a walk on the beach required an escort and appropriate attire to protect the skin from the sun. In the fall, the houses were closed, the furniture was covered with covers, and the caravan returned to the city. The country house fell asleep, keeping within its walls the echoes of summer laughter and secret dramas. It was a circular life, where the change of seasons meant only a change of clothes and location, but not the script of life. Time was relentless, and the Gilded Age was coming to an end, taking with it the fates of its heroines. Women grew old, their beauty faded, and they lost their main currency on the social market. Huge mansions, once full of guests and music, became empty and too large for their inhabitants. Widows remained alone, surrounded by portraits and memories, guarded only by loyal old servants. These servants, who had grown old alongside their mistresses, became their only family and companions. The boundaries between mistress and servant were finally erased under the weight of shared years and experiences. Together, they reminisced about balls that would never be again and people who were gone forever. These conversations brought to life an era full of glamour and tragedy, an era that had crumbled to dust. The world was changing. Cars and telephones appeared. Women began to demand the right to vote. But the old ladies in their mansions continued to live by the rules of Victorian morality, rejecting the new era. Their dresses went out of fashion, their manners seemed archaic, but they clung to them as if they were their last straw. It was a majestic and sad decline, full of dignity and quiet sadness. Many of them never knew true happiness, sacrificing it for the sake of duty and reputation. They fulfilled their role. They married, bore heirs, kept house, but at what cost? At the end of their lives, sitting by the fireplace, they may have asked themselves, was this gilded cage worth living in for a lifetime? And often the answer, echoing in the silence of the empty room, was no. The history of the Gilded Age is a story of a beautiful facade that hid broken destinies. It reminds us that wealth does not guarantee freedom, and sometimes takes it away forever. The echo of their footsteps still resounds in the museum halls that were once their homes, reminding us of a time when beauty demanded sacrifice. And these houses themselves stand as monuments to invisible tears and unspoken words. We walked through the corridors of time, peered behind velvet curtains, and climbed dark service staircases. We saw that behind the dazzling glamour of the Gilded Age lay a profound human drama. Behind every diamond necklace was a story of loneliness, and behind every lavish reception was the quiet tragedy of a woman deprived of her voice. These stories teach us to see beyond the exterior facade to the true value of things and events. They remind us that happiness is not measured by the number of rooms in a house or the carats in one's ears. Which of these invisible heroine stories touched you the most? What aspect of the lives of women in the past would you like to learn more about in our next videos? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel so that we can discover new secrets of history together.